On the 21st of November 2013, reigning world champion Vishy Anand sat down opposite his 22-year-old challenger Magnus Carlsen. They were playing Game 9 of their 12-game World Championship match, and Vishy was losing by 2 games. So he was in pretty much a must-win situation because he had the white pieces and he had to press. So what did he play? Well, a super sharp line of the Nimzo Indian, the Simic variation, which we'll see on board now. And I just had to cover this game after covering this variation yesterday in the Firuzja So game. And I'll link that at the end if you want to check it out. So this Simic variation starts with this pawn to f3 move. That's what Vishy played here. And both players were up for a fight now. So Magnus went pawn to d5, it immediately clamps down on this e4 move. We had now pawn to a3, a capture here, shattering the pawn structure, but white's gained the bishop pair. Now we had pawn to c5 from Magnus, we had takes here by Vishy, recaptures with the pawn. You can take with the knight there, which we saw in the World Championship match between Anand and Kramnik in 2008. And now pawn to e3 from Vishy. He doesn't go pawn to e4 here, as we note. So although he blocks in his bishop like this, he's going to rapidly develop his king side here and then go after Magnus's king. Now Magnus had some options here. Castles is the main move, but Magnus played pawn to c4, a really fighting idea. He's immediately taking that tension away in the centre, and so Vishy now has a free hand on the king side, but he's looking to expand on the queen side and gain an advantage there. So really double-edged, the battle lines are drawn. The knight now comes to e2 developing. We had knight c6 and pawn to g4 from Vishy. So here's the idea, he's going to throw the kitchen sink at Magnus. Can Magnus survive this? So now we had castles, bishop to g2 developing, and knight to a5 from Magnus, completely uncompromising how he now continues on with his plan. Castles from Vishy, knight to b3, so the rook is hit here and protects itself on a2, and now pawn to b5, let's go with that queenside expansion. But knight to g3 now comes from Vishy, so he wants to play pawn to g5 here, but first he's covering that h5 square, so the knight can't jump in here. Now we had pawn to a5 from Magnus, he gets on with his plan, pawn to g5, and now the knight drops back to e8 here, which is really important. It has to come back to that square, d7 is no good. From here it's going to remaneuver into c7, and that's the more active square because it then looks at these ones here, and we'll see the importance of that later on. So pawn to e4 now from Vishy, he strikes in the centre, a classic break, opening up the bishop, and Magnus can't afford to leave Vishy with that dark squared bishop, so now he chops it off before it comes into the game. The queen recaptures, and rook to a6 is a beautiful rook lift from Magnus. It covers that 6th rank, lends some support to the king. Now we had pawn e5 from Vishy, so he's clamping down further on the black king, and obviously this is looking really scary now for Magnus. Now Magnus did already consider going pawn to g6 here to take some defensive measures on the king side, but what he was fearful of was that after pawn to f4, knight to g7 to blockade here, white could actually switch plans here and play rook to b2. So you attack this pawn, say you defend with rook b6, then queen b1 is a nice multi-purpose move. You pressure here, and you also look at f5 to support a later break there. Say queen d7 to hold this pawn. The problem here is that the black pawns have been stymied now on the queen side, and white still has some king side attacking options. This is what Magnus was fearful of. So after pawn e5, he instead went knight to c7, but this is so double-edged now and so daring to play like this, because after pawn to f4, pawn to b4, after Vishy exchanges here, which he did, and swaps off a pair of rooks, when the knight recaptures here, which is how Magnus played, you can see that this knight is now miles away from the king, and that king is really coming under fire. So what did Magnus have in mind? Well, pawn to f5 came here, and now pawn to b3 from Magnus. Again, so bold to just have the nerve to trust your queenside counterplay. And what he's foreseen here is that this pawn should give sufficient counterplay, but it's just walking on a tightrope this entire time. So queen f4 comes now. What's going on here? Well, after knight to c7, Magnus recycles that knight to come back to the king side. We had pawn f6, pawn g6 trying to keep things closed, but now queen h4. And there's a massive threat here. So the queen is simply coming in like this and delivering mate on the dark squares. So how on earth do you respond to this as black? Well, if you try and move your king out of the way, so that after queen h6 threatening mate, you cover it with the rook, this is no good because the rook lifts into the game and you're threatening to mate here. Say you go b2, ready to make a queen, well you can actually checkmate like this. You give up the queen and mate on the h-file. Really thematic. So that's why you can't come across with the king and the rook like that to block the checkmate. Instead, you have to use this knight, and this is why Magnus moved it back to the king side. It has to cover that g7 square. If you come to e6, it's no good because the bishop on h3 can pressure that piece and chop it off soon. So we had knight e8, the only way to respond to the threat, but you do box in your rook. Really ugly stuff. However, how does white actually increase the pressure here? Well, queen h6 was the start. And what Vishy had in mind was that after pawn to b2, which Magnus played, this is just one step away from queening now, he lifted his rook into the game. Now, why is he carrying on the attack here? Well, if you play passively and respond to black with, say, rook b1, looking to pick up that pawn, then queen a5 comes. And you can't take here, or you have this check on the back rank, you're picking up the rook in a moment, and basically the fizzle has gone out of the white attack, so you just have to keep attacking here as white. Vishy recognised this, so after pawn b2, he played this phenomenal move, rook to f4. He's coming to that h-file to deliver mate, but allowing Magnus to queen here, which Magnus duly does. So Vishy's in check. He has to block that check. And unfortunately for him, he did it in the wrong manner here. So he should have blocked with the bishop. And then the players calculated a very long line which goes like this. So the queen comes to d1. You're covering this h5 square as the key. So after the rook switches across, threatening mate here, you have this astonishing move, queen h5, blocking the path of the rook. So the knight captures here, the pawn recaptures, rook takes, threatening mate, but once again there's a beautiful defensive resource. Bishop f5, you cover that checkmating square. And then just to show you one line that the players were working out here, say the bishop comes to h3, obviously you can't take here or you get mated here, so it drops back to g6, and they were looking at this interesting pawn push to e6, and what they were both calculating was that black would have to give back a piece like this. You could have something like this as a line, the rook switching to e5, and if black captured here, opening the rook, attacking the white king, well, queen e3 switches back to defend here, the bishop covers here, and it's a very double-edged position. Black's a bit better, but the players thought that it should be roughly equal, even though black is a pawn up. But okay, we didn't have any of this as a line. After b1 equals queen, Vishy blocked with the wrong piece. He went knight f1. And the massive problem with this is that it allowed queen to e1 now instead of coming to d1. Why is this so drastically different? Well, now if the rook comes to the h-file, you can simply chop off that rook here like this. After the queen recaptures, black is simply a whole rook up, and there's just no more mating threats. So the queen could come out to a5, hitting this pawn, the knight still covers g7, white would be forced to backpedal, holding this pawn, and now the pieces start unravelling. And black is just going to slowly crush the position using that extra rook. So coming back to this position here, after Magnus played queen to e1, Vishy actually resigned. And this put Magnus 3 points ahead going into game 10. They went on to draw that game, Magnus playing white, and he was therefore crowned world champion for the first time in 2013, a title he's held to this day in 2022. If you enjoyed this game, then do subscribe to the channel to see more like it, and to see an amazing Firouz Jasot game that I covered yesterday in this line, then click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.